There was a moment, a precise instant in human history, when the sound of the living stopped exceeding the sound of the dying. It happened without announcement, without fanfare, unobserved by chroniclers and unmarked by bells. In the winter months following the great pandemic, Europe discovered something it had never known before. Quiet. Not the quiet of peaceful slumber or rural solitude, but the profound silence that emerges when half of civilization simply ceases to exist. The absence of sound, so complete, so overwhelming, that survivors found themselves startled by their own breathing, by the crunch of snow beneath their feet, by the whisper of wind through streets that had once thrummed with the constant percussion of human commerce. The death carts had stopped coming. That was the first thing people noticed. The rhythmic squeak of their wheels, the mournful tolling of bells summoning the dead, the calls of "Bring out your dead." These sounds, which had become the terrible soundtrack of an entire civilization's dissolution, had finally ceased. And in their absence, something unexpected bloomed. Not joy, not quite. Survivors were too hollowed for that. But something like wonder, something like recognition of a new world, one that might yet be inhabited by the living. This is the story of that winter. Not the winter of plague itself. That horror has been told and retold until the words have worn smooth from repeated use. This is the story of what came after, the story of how Europe learned to live again in a landscape that had been scoured clean of everything familiar, a continent that had been reduced to its barest elements, and forced to rebuild not just structures and systems, but the very fabric of human meaning itself. To understand the silence, one must first understand what had been lost. The great mortality, what later generations would call the pestilence, the plague, the visitation, had swept through the continent like some apocalyptic tide, leaving behind it a transformed landscape that seemed almost alien to those who survived. In the cities, the death toll had been most catastrophic. The great merchant republics and trade centers of the known world had seen 3/4 of their populations perish within the space of 2 years. The grand palaces and civic buildings that had taken centuries to construct now stood empty, their ornate facades crumbling, their servants long dead or fled. The waterways that had once choked with vessels bearing spices from distant lands and treasures from across the known world now hosted only ghost ships. The boats of plague-ridden merchants hastily scuttled and left to rot in the water, their hulls gradually sinking into the soft bottom. Across the continent, cities had been reduced by similar proportions. The great cathedral of one renowned city stood partly completed, its dome still unfinished, a metaphor so obvious that later writers would struggle not to overuse it. The workshops where the masters had trained apprentices, where the secrets of perspective and form had been transmitted from one generation to the next, now housed only rats and darkness. The knowledge accumulated over lifetimes vanished not with a bang but with a whimper, as master craftsmen died without apprentices to receive their secrets, without students to carry forward the accumulated wisdom of their hands and eyes. The sprawling northern cities had hemorrhaged people as if cut by some invisible blade. Entire parishes had been emptied. In some cases, the last residents had simply locked their doors from the inside, preferring to die in familiar surroundings rather than venture into a world that had become unrecognizable. Families that had occupied the same houses for generations found themselves reduced to single individuals. A widow, an orphaned child, a man suddenly conscious of the terrible fact that he had no one left to whom he could pass on his name. But it was not in the cities where the true catastrophe unfolded, though that is where chroniclers had chosen to focus their attention. The death had reached even further, into the countryside, into the villages and hamlets where the vast majority of Europe's population had always lived. The great agricultural heartland, those carefully cultivated fields and vineyards that had fed the continent for centuries, lay abandoned. With 3/4 of the peasantry dead, with the feudal system suddenly revealed to be as fragile as paper, with entire noble families extinct, the whole machinery of agricultural production had seized and ground to a halt. In the fields, the grain rotted unharvested. The animals that had not been driven mad by neglect and starvation had reverted to something wilder, something less domesticated. Wolves, those creatures that men had fought for centuries to drive back to the margins of civilization, began to reclaim territory they had not seen since before the great cities were built. They moved through abandoned villages with an almost aristocratic disdain, picking through the remnants of human habitation as if inventorying their newly restored inheritance. Entire regions had simply ceased to exist as organized societies. The great monasteries, those centers of learning and spiritual authority that had survived the fall of Rome and all the centuries of barbarian incursions, lay empty of monks. The libraries, oh, the irreplaceable libraries, where manuscripts had been copied with such meticulous care, where the accumulated knowledge of the classical world had been preserved through the long centuries of ignorance, now fell silent. The dust that accumulated on the shelves seemed to whisper secrets that no one would ever read. The forests began to reclaim what had been taken from them. The boundary between civilization and wilderness, that line that had been pushed back so gradually over centuries that most people could not see it moving, began to advance again with startling speed. Within a single generation, forests had regrown in places where men had cleared fields. The great oaks and chestnuts that had been cut down for timber grew back in a tangled profusion, pushing up through the stones of buildings that men had built with such confidence in their permanence. And yet, despite this apocalyptic transformation, there was something else happening. In the silence left by the cessation of the death carts, in the spaces created by the absence of so much human noise, something unexpected had begun to take shape. The survivors, those strange, shell-shocked remnants of a civilization that had seemed eternal only months before, were slowly awakening to the possibility that life might continue. The winter that followed the end of the great mortality was, in many ways, the crucial moment. It was neither the apex of the catastrophe nor the beginning of recovery, but something in between. It was the threshold between one world and another. The snow fell gently on landscapes that had been transformed utterly, covering the traces of death with a blanket of white, erasing for a time the visible marks of catastrophe. In the villages that still had survivors, people emerged from their homes with the tentative movements of creatures recovering from a long illness. The physical act of living, of gathering wood for fires, of finding food, of maintaining the simple tasks that keep a body alive, continued as it always had. But now these tasks had a different quality to them. They had been stripped of their routine character. Each act of survival was conscious, deliberate, almost ceremonial in its significance. For the first time in generations, perhaps for the first time in all of recorded history, large portions of Europe suddenly experienced what could only be described as a surplus of resources. With 3/4 of the population gone, with the surviving population stripped down to the bare minimum necessary to continue the human story, the arithmetic of scarcity had been completely inverted. There was suddenly enough grain stored in barns that survived the catastrophe, enough shelter in the form of empty houses, enough tools, enough clothing, enough of the material apparatus of survival that the living could suddenly stop fighting each other for crumbs. But this is not to say that survival was easy. Indeed, the winter brought its own terrors. The survivors, traumatized by months of constant death, by the sight of bodies piled in mass graves or burned in great pyres, by the sound of the death carts and the sight of the corpse gatherers, these images had seared themselves into the collective consciousness. Many of the living bore the physical and psychological scars of their ordeal. Some had developed a kind of practical wisdom through mere luck, having been too isolated or too fortunate to encounter the plague in its most virulent form. Others bore the marks of infection upon their skin, the blackened fingers and running sores that marked them as touched by the pestilence. Many were orphaned children, suddenly thrust into a world with no one to guide them. Others were old people, suddenly conscious that they had outlived their own significance, their knowledge and experience rendered moot by the sudden transformation of everything they had known. The night itself became different during that first winter. It was not merely that the streets were emptier, that went without saying. It was that the entire quality of darkness had changed. In the cities, the constant lights of human habitation, the candles in windows, the torches at crossroads, the fires burning in countless homes, had been extinguished in such numbers that the nights became profoundly dark. Stars that had not been visible for generations suddenly reappeared in the urban sky. The Milky Way, that river of light that had been obscured by the luminescence of human civilization, once again became visible to those who looked up from the streets. This visible transformation was not merely aesthetic. It represented a kind of return, a restoration of something that had been lost. And for many survivors, looking up at the stars meant something different than it had before. It meant a kind of perspective on human affairs that the endless tumult of normal life often obscures. Here was proof that there were things larger than human mortality, larger than plague and death and fear. The stars had continued to wheel overhead, regardless of what had happened below. Life and death, the sudden loss of half of civilization, these were events of profound significance to the humans caught within them, but they barely registered in the cosmic order. For some survivors, this perspective was comforting. For others, it was a source of profound despair. The universe, indifferent to human suffering, suggested that human suffering might itself be meaningless. This was a dangerous thought, and many people spent the winter fighting against it, struggling to construct new meanings, new frameworks within which the catastrophe could be integrated into a comprehensible universe. The Church, that institution which had provided the primary framework for understanding the world for nearly 1,000 years, offered explanations for the catastrophe, though its own authority had been severely shaken. If God was all-powerful and all-knowing, if he was the author of creation, then surely the plague, this decimation of his people, this apparent victory for suffering and death, must be part of his plan. But what plan could possibly justify such horror? This question gnawed at the minds of believers and skeptics alike. Some concluded that the plague was God's judgment on a wicked world. This interpretation, while theologically comforting in a strange way, it at least suggested that events meant something, that God was still in control, led to its own horrors. Scapegoats were identified. Religious minorities were blamed, despite the fact that the plague had decimated their communities as thoroughly as others. Heretics and witches were suspected. Flagellants wandered through the countryside, whipping themselves in the belief that penitential suffering might satisfy God's anger and halt the plague. These movements, born from genuine spiritual anguish, sometimes devolved into violence and madness. Others, particularly among the survivors of the intellectual and scholarly classes, began to question the very foundations of the understanding that religious authorities had imposed on the world. If God was truly good and truly powerful, how could he have allowed this? The question was not new. Medieval theologians had grappled with the problem of evil for centuries, but now it carried the weight of immediate, visceral experience. The abstraction of theology became concrete when one had seen one's own children die of plague. In the depths of that first winter, as snow covered the transformed landscape and the reduced population huddled in their homes, a kind of collective reckoning began. It was not organized or conscious. There were no councils or assemblies dedicated to the task of remaking civilization, but it happened nevertheless, in the conversations between survivors, in the decisions about what would be preserved and what would be abandoned, in the small choices that accumulated into the shape of a new world. One of the most profound changes was the sudden recognition that the old hierarchies were not as immutable as they had seemed. The feudal system, that elaborate pyramid of obligation and authority that had organized society for centuries, had been based on certain assumptions about scarcity and population. When lords held most of the resources and peasants were abundant, the system functioned. But when the population had been reduced by 3/4, when there was suddenly no shortage of resources, but a shortage of people, the mathematics changed. Peasants who had survived the plague found themselves in a position of sudden power. They could demand higher wages for their labor, better living conditions, greater freedom. They could refuse service to lords, walk away from their obligations, strike out for new territories where their services would be valued more highly. The old bonds of obligation, frayed by death and catastrophe, suddenly seemed remarkably fragile. In some regions, this led to violent conflict. Lords, unwilling to relinquish their ancient prerogatives, attempted to enforce the old system, but they were fewer in number, weakened by losses of their own. The peasants who survived discovered that they could resist, and increasingly they did. In other regions, a kind of pragmatic accommodation was reached. Lords and peasants, recognizing that they needed each other to rebuild civilization, negotiated new terms. The old feudalism never fully recovered. It limped on in various forms for centuries to come, but it never regained the absolute authority it had possessed before the plague. This transformation of social relations was not immediately apparent, particularly in that first winter. The winter was a time of relative stasis, a kind of pause in the forward movement of history. Snow blanketed the landscape, temperatures plummeted, and survival itself took on a more direct form. The energy required simply to stay alive through the winter months left little room for social experimentation. And yet, even in this stasis, the seeds of change were being planted. In the villages and towns where people huddled through the long nights, conversations began about what came next. Communities that had lost large portions of their populations had to make decisions about consolidation. Some villages were simply abandoned. There were not enough survivors to maintain them, and it made more sense to move to larger settlements. The survivors of smaller hamlets packed their belongings on sleds and made their way through the snow to the nearest town that had enough people to form a viable community. This movement, gradual though it was, represented a significant transformation. The pattern of settlement that had been established over centuries, the careful distribution of population across the landscape, the small villages and hamlets that had dotted the countryside, suddenly made less sense. The survivors tended to concentrate in towns, creating what one might call the first intentional reorganization of European population distribution since the fall of Rome. The consolidation of survivors into towns had profound consequences for the winter itself. It meant that resources could be pooled more effectively. A larger community could organize its survival more efficiently than scattered individuals could. The collective knowledge of a town, how to preserve food, how to maintain fires, how to care for the sick and injured, could be more effectively deployed when people were concentrated in one location. But it also meant something else, something that would echo through the centuries to come. It meant that the survivors were increasingly separated from the landscape that had sustained them. The farmers who had worked the land for generations were suddenly living in towns, cut off from the fields that had been the basis of all economic production. This separation would create tensions and challenges that would reshape European society over the centuries to come. The winter nights, that endless stretch of darkness and cold, became the canvas upon which survivors began to paint their new stories. In the cottages and townhouses, around fires that burned with a precious intensity, people sat together and told stories. Not the old stories necessarily, though some of those were retold, but new stories, stories that tried to make sense of what had happened, that attempted to integrate the catastrophe into a comprehensible narrative. These stories took many forms. Some were religious, attempting to understand the plague as part of God's plan. Others were more secular, focused on the random chance and human foolishness that had allowed the disease to spread so widely. Some were personal narratives, tales of individuals who had survived against the odds, who had made impossible choices in the face of the plague and lived to tell about them. The act of storytelling itself became a kind of ritual, a way of binding the survivors together, of creating a community from the scattered remnants of civilization. In the long winter nights, when the darkness seemed total and the future seemed wholly uncertain, these stories provided a kind of scaffolding, a structure upon which people could reconstruct their sense of meaning and purpose. One type of story that became particularly prominent was the tale of survival through piety. Stories circulated of clergy who had been spared because of their faith, or who had miraculously recovered from plague, or who had been protected by divine intervention while caring for the sick. These stories served multiple functions. They reinforced religious faith, they provided role models for behavior, and they suggested that the catastrophe was not entirely random, that there was some way in which human agency or virtue could influence outcomes. Parallel to these were stories of survival through practical wisdom, tales circulated of people who had recognized the signs of plague early and isolated themselves, who had kept their families alive through careful rationing and clever use of resources, who had made the right choices at the right times. These stories emphasized human agency and practical knowledge rather than divine intervention, though the two could be combined in various ways. There were also stories of the dead, of people's husbands and wives, children and parents who had been lost to the plague. These stories served as a kind of collective memory, a way of ensuring that the dead would not be entirely forgotten. In communities where a large majority of the population had died, these stories were crucial to maintaining continuity with the past, to ensuring that the survivors felt connected to those who had gone before. As the winter deepened, another crucial process began to unfold. Survivors slowly started to recognize that the catastrophe, terrible though it had been, had created a kind of tabula rasa, a blank slate upon which new things could be written. The old certainties had been stripped away, the ancient families had been decimated or entirely wiped out. The old power structures had been revealed as fragile. The religious authorities, while still powerful, had lost some of their authority. Many people questioned whether they had truly been serving the interests of the community or whether they had been complicit in the catastrophe. In this space of uncertainty and emptiness, new ideas began to germinate. Some of these ideas would eventually flower into great cultural and intellectual movements that would define the centuries to come. Others would lead to violent religious conflicts and social upheaval. But all of them were born in that winter, in the long nights when survivors sat in the darkness and allowed themselves to imagine what might come next. The quiet of that winter was not a complete quiet. There were still sounds, the crackle of fires, the sound of wind, the calls of animals that had moved into the empty spaces left by human death. But it was quiet in comparison to what had come before. And in that relative quiet, European civilization found the space to begin its long work of recovery and reinvention. As the winter progressed, patterns began to emerge. In some regions, communities organized themselves around new principles. The old hierarchical structures, while not entirely abandoned, became more flexible. Those who possessed skills, blacksmiths, carpenters, healers, those who understood the management of food and resources, found themselves with more bargaining power. Knowledge became valuable in a new way. The survivors who understood how to preserve food, how to care for the sick, how to work with tools and materials, these people suddenly held status and authority that their social birth might not have suggested. Women's roles shifted dramatically in many regions. With so many men dead, with the labor shortage so acute, women found themselves taking on roles and responsibilities that had previously been denied them. Some became heads of households and estates. Some took over the management of businesses and trades. Some became leaders in their communities, making decisions that affected the survival of entire villages. These changes were not the result of any conscious movement for equality. Such a thing was unthinkable in that era, but rather the simple practical requirement that someone had to do the work that needed to be done. The shortage of labor also led to technological innovation. Where hands were scarce, machines became valuable. People who had previously relied on human labor began to experiment with watermills and windmills, with new tools and techniques that could increase productivity. The great age of medieval technological stagnation ended not because someone suddenly had a brilliant idea, but because necessity truly was the mother of invention. The winter also brought a curious kind of leveling of status. When everyone is cold and hungry, when everyone is terrified by the darkness, when everyone is traumatized by the loss of so many people, the old markers of status become less meaningful. A nobleman who knew how to keep a fire going was no better than a peasant with the same skill. The former religious leader who understood how to organize the distribution of grain was valued not because of his position, but because he could solve practical problems. This leveling was not permanent. The old hierarchies would return in modified form, but during that first winter it was real. It created a kind of egalitarian moment, a time when different social classes were forced to work together on an equal basis simply to survive. The memory of this leveling would persist. People would remember a time when the old rules did not apply, when a different way of organizing society had seemed possible. Religion took on new forms during that winter, adapted to the new realities of a devastated landscape. The great cathedrals stood empty or partially occupied. In many cases, the surviving religious leadership was insufficient to maintain all the churches, and some had to be abandoned. New forms of religious practice emerged, less formal and hierarchical, more focused on community gathering and mutual support. In some regions, popular religious movements grew in power. These movements, which often existed on the margins of official religious teaching, suddenly found audiences receptive to their messages. Groups of wandering preachers, mystics, and radical interpreters of scripture traveled through the countryside, offering their own interpretations of what the plague meant and what the divine demanded of humanity. The official religious authorities struggled to maintain their authority in the face of these challenges, yet they also adapted. Clergy who survived often became more focused on pastoral care and community support. The somewhat distant and formal spirituality of the pre-plague era gave way to something more immediate and personal. Those in religious positions became healers and counselors, not just administrators of ritual. As the winter progressed and the worst of the cold passed, people began to venture further from their immediate communities. Trade routes, disrupted by the plague, slowly began to reopen. Merchants eager to restore their fortunes took risks to travel to distant markets. But they found a transformed landscape. The great trade fairs that had once gathered merchants from across Europe found themselves with fewer participants. But also, interestingly, they found a market with new demands and new possibilities. The scarcity of labor meant that simple manufactures, items that could be produced by hand without extensive specialized training, became valuable. The scarcity of certain raw materials, due to the abandonment of mines and forests, created markets for substitutes and alternatives. The whole pattern of medieval trade, which had been relatively stable for centuries, suddenly entered a period of rapid transformation. One of the most significant changes was in the price of land relative to labor. Before the plague, land had been valuable and labor cheap. After the plague, the equation was reversed. Land, abundant and in many cases abandoned, became less valuable. Labor, scarce and in high demand, became more valuable. This fundamental shift in the economics of production would reshape society over the coming decades and centuries. The winter was also a time of profound psychological and spiritual transformation. The survivors had to grapple with a fundamental shift in their understanding of the world. The medieval worldview, which had emphasized hierarchy, order, and the eternal nature of social arrangements, had been undermined by the plague. If the divine permitted such chaos and suffering, if the order of the world could be so thoroughly disrupted, then perhaps that order was less eternal and immutable than had been believed. This questioning manifested in various ways. Some people became more devout, interpreting the plague as punishment and seeking to live more virtuously. Others became more skeptical, questioning whether the divine existed at all or whether he was truly interested in human affairs. Still others developed a kind of dark humor about the situation, mocking the pretensions of those who had survived or died, creating sardonic commentary on the human condition. The figure of death itself became prominent in art and literature during this period. The symbolic dance of death became a popular artistic motif, depicting death engaging with people from all social classes, rich and poor, religious and secular. This artistic preoccupation was not morbid in the way later treatments of death would be. Rather, it was a way of processing trauma, of acknowledging that death had become suddenly and terrifyingly familiar, that it had visited rich and poor alike. The winter nights became occasions for new forms of social experimentation. In some communities, people began to gather in new ways, to tell stories and songs that would not have been permitted in the old social order. The carnival traditions that had existed in pre-plague Europe took on new energy and new meanings. The inversion of social order that carnival allowed, where peasants could mock the powerful, where women could assume roles normally reserved for men, where the normal rules could be temporarily suspended, became more important as a release valve for a society dealing with trauma and transformation. Music changed during this period. The somber religious music of the medieval period continued, but it was joined by new forms of secular music, new instruments, new modes of expression. The survivors, isolated in their communities, began to develop regional variations in music and culture. The unified Christendom that religious ideology had attempted to construct was in reality fragmenting into a multitude of local cultures, each shaped by its particular experience of the plague and recovery. In the great halls that remained intact, Where the survivors had gathered for warmth and mutual protection, musicians began to experiment with new instruments and new forms. Some of these would eventually develop into the musical traditions that would characterize the centuries to come. The harp, the lute, the pipe. These instruments took on new importance as people sought comfort in music and found in music a way to express emotions that words could not capture. The oral transmission of knowledge, which had been one of the primary ways that information passed between generations, took on new urgency. With so many dying, with entire bodies of knowledge disappearing, survivors became acutely aware of the fragility of transmission. Those who possessed specialized knowledge, blacksmiths, herbalists, midwives, those who understood the healing arts, found themselves suddenly valuable beyond measure. They began to think consciously about how to pass on their knowledge, to carefully explain to those who would listen the secrets of their crafts. This focus on the transmission of knowledge had profound effects. In some cases, it led to the democratization of information. Skilled workers began to train more apprentices, understanding that the loss of knowledge had been one of the great tragedies of the plague. In other cases, it led to a kind of hoarding of information, with craftspeople keeping their secrets closely guarded, understanding that knowledge was now a form of wealth and power. The winter also witnessed the beginning of what would eventually become a major transformation in the way Europeans understood agriculture and land management. With so much land suddenly abandoned, with so few people available to work it, survivors began to make conscious choices about which lands to cultivate and which to leave fallow. Some regions were deliberately depopulated, allowed to return to nature. Others became focal points for resettlement and new agricultural development. These choices were not made consciously or deliberately at first. Rather, they emerged from the accumulated decisions of thousands of individuals, each making choices about where to settle, where to plant crops, where to graze animals. But over the course of the winter and into the spring, patterns became visible. The landscape was being reorganized, reshaped by the decisions of a much smaller human population. The concept of property itself underwent transformation during this period. In the pre-plague world, property had been defined largely by feudal relationships. The lord owned the land and the peasants held it at his pleasure. But when entire noble families died without heirs, when property became suddenly abundant, the old definitions began to break down. Survivors began to occupy land simply because it was empty, and possession began to acquire a kind of legal weight simply through the fact of occupation. This transformation in the concept of property would have profound effects over the coming centuries. It would eventually lead to the development of a more individualistic concept of property rights, one that emphasized personal ownership rather than feudal obligation. But that development lay in the future. During that first winter, it was simply a practical response to the abundance of empty land and the scarcity of people to make claims to it. As the winter deepened into its coldest months, the survivors found themselves facing a new and unexpected challenge: psychological depression on a massive scale. The shock of survival had worn off, replaced by the grinding reality of existence in a world stripped of almost everything familiar. The isolation, the cold, the constant awareness of death and loss began to take their psychological toll. Suicides increased during this period, though the exact numbers are impossible to determine. Chronicles and records, when they exist at all, often fail to mention such deaths, considering them either unworthy of record or too shameful to document. But the evidence suggests that many survivors, having made it through the plague itself, were unable to bear the psychological weight of what came after. The sheer overwhelming sadness of realizing that everyone and everything one had loved was gone proved too much for some to endure. Others responded to this depression with a kind of desperate gaiety. They drank heavily, celebrated excessively, seemed to deny through their behavior the reality of what had happened. These reactions, which shocked more serious-minded survivors, were responses to the same psychological crisis, an attempt to live, to assert the existence of joy and pleasure in the face of a world that seemed to have nothing but sorrow to offer. The winter nights grew longer and darker as the season advanced, and with them came a deepening of the existential crisis that survivors faced. Many had lost not just family members, but entire communities. They had watched their worlds collapse, had seen everything they understood to be true and certain revealed as fragile and temporary. The psychological frameworks they had used to make sense of their lives, frameworks built on religious certainty, on the eternal nature of social order, on the predictability of the future, had been shattered. In response to this crisis, new forms of spirituality began to emerge. Some survivors turned to increasingly mystical and ecstatic forms of religious experience, seeking direct encounters with the divine rather than relying on the mediated spirituality offered by institutional religion. Others began to develop new philosophical frameworks, new ways of understanding the world that could accommodate the catastrophe they had experienced. The study of the natural world took on new importance during this period. As traditional sources of authority, the religious hierarchy, the ancient texts, the inherited wisdom, had proven inadequate to explain the plague. Survivors began to look more carefully at the world around them, seeking clues to understanding and to preventing future catastrophes. This empirical turn, this beginning to observe nature directly rather than filtering observations through inherited texts, would eventually contribute to the scientific revolution that would reshape European understanding centuries later. The role of women in this transformation deserves particular attention. As mentioned earlier, women had taken on new roles and responsibilities out of necessity, but they also played a crucial role in the psychological and cultural adaptation to the new world. Women were often the keepers of oral traditions, the transmitters of knowledge about healing and survival. As the pandemic had disrupted so many normal patterns, women's knowledge about which plants could heal, how to preserve food, how to care for children and manage households became newly valued. In some cases, this increased status led to a temporary expansion of women's intellectual and social roles. Some women found themselves in positions where they could exercise authority over communities. Some began to engage in intellectual pursuits that had previously been denied them. Some learned to read and write, skills that had been restricted to the clergy and nobility, because these skills were needed to manage property and resources. However, this expansion was largely temporary. As society began to reorganize and reassert traditional hierarchies, women's roles were often contracted again. But the memory of the period when women had held greater authority and autonomy would persist, and would occasionally resurface in later periods, as women sought to expand their social roles. The winter also witnessed major changes in the organization of labor and work. With so much labor needed and so few people available to do it, the old systems of compulsory labor began to break down. Peasants who had been bound to their lords found that they could demand payment for their labor, could negotiate better terms. In some cases, peasants simply left their old homes and traveled to new regions where their services were more highly valued. This mobility of labor, which would have been unthinkable in the pre-plague world, began to reshape European society. The static hierarchical society of feudalism depended on people staying in their assigned places. Once people began to move, to seek better opportunities, to choose where they would work, the entire system began to shift. The flow of people during that first winter created new communities and depopulated old ones. Some regions experienced growth as people fled from more devastated areas and sought shelter in places where they had relatives or connections. Other regions were nearly emptied as their remaining population moved toward larger settlements or toward regions where economic opportunities seemed better. These movements of people created new cultural contacts and interactions. People from different regions and backgrounds were thrown together in new communities, forced to learn to work together and live together. This mix of populations, while sometimes leading to conflict, also led to cultural exchange and innovation. New ideas, new techniques, new ways of understanding the world were shared and blended. The market for goods and services transformed dramatically during this period. With labor scarce and abundant manufactured goods available from pre-plague production, prices shifted in unprecedented ways. The value of manufactured goods decreased, while the price of labor increased. This had the effect of making certain goods more affordable for the poor. The abundance of pre-plague production meant that even those with few resources could access items that would have been luxuries in the pre-plague world. For merchants and craftspeople, this transformation created both challenges and opportunities. The old patterns of trade, which had been stable for centuries, suddenly became uncertain. Merchants who had relied on the exploitation of price, differentials between regions found that the sudden abundance of goods in some areas and scarcity in others created new possibilities for profit, but also new risks. Some merchants adapted quickly to the new situation, understanding that the market now rewarded those who could quickly identify where demand existed and supply goods to meet it. Others held to the old patterns longer, believing that the disruption was temporary and that normal trade patterns would eventually resume. Those who adapted quickly generally prospered. Those who held to the old ways often found their businesses failing. As the winter progressed toward its end, a new kind of hope began to emerge among the survivors. Not a naive optimism, the traumatized survivors were far too realistic for that, but a kind of cautious recognition that life continued, that the immediate catastrophe had passed, that there might be a future, even if that future looked radically different from what had come before. The physical signs of approaching spring brought this hope into sharper focus. The snow began to melt. The first green shoots began to emerge from the frozen ground. Birds that had fled the plague-stricken regions began to return. The world, which had seemed stopped in a moment of death and devastation, began to move again. For the survivors, these signs of renewal were deeply meaningful. They suggested that the natural world, at least, operated according to patterns that were larger than the temporary catastrophe of the plague. Life in its plant and animal forms continued its cycles regardless of human suffering. There was something both comforting and challenging about this fact. It suggested that the human world, with all its suffering and loss, was part of a larger natural order that operated according to its own laws. The approaching spring also brought practical challenges. The stores of food that had sustained communities through the winter were beginning to run low. Soon, the survivors would need to plant new crops to begin the work of agricultural production that would sustain them through the coming year. The question of who would do this work, and under what terms, was now pressing and urgent. In communities where lordship had survived, the question of labor relations became contentious. Lords expected to mobilize the survivors to work the land according to the old patterns of obligation. But peasants, having survived the plague, having experienced a time when the old hierarchies had broken down, were often unwilling to return to those patterns. Some peasants refused outright to work on the same terms they had before. Others negotiated carefully with their lords, seeking concessions in exchange for their labor. In some cases, peasants threatened to leave entirely, to take their skills and labor to other regions where they would be more valued. The lords, weakened by losses of their own, found themselves in the unfamiliar position of having to negotiate rather than simply command. These negotiations, taking place in individual communities across the continent, represented one of the first major challenges to the feudal system. The system, which had seemed immutable and eternal, suddenly appeared subject to change and modification. The social revolution that would eventually lead to the end of feudalism was beginning not in any coordinated way, but through thousands of small negotiations between individual lords and individual peasant communities. In some regions, these negotiations led to relatively rapid change. Lords who needed labor more than they needed traditional power relationships began to grant concessions, lower rents, greater personal freedom, the right to move to other lands if desired. Over time, these concessions accumulated, and feudalism in those regions began to evolve into something different, something that left more room for personal choice and market relationships. In other regions, change came more slowly, accompanied by violent conflict. Lords who refused to negotiate found themselves facing peasant rebellions and uprisings. These conflicts, which would continue intermittently for centuries, represented a fundamental challenge to the social order. They suggested that the old system of obligation could not be simply reimposed, that survivors who had experienced the leveling of the plague had tasted something different and found it worth fighting for. The winter's end, as spring became increasingly evident, brought a sense of transition and threshold. The survivors who had made it through the coldest months found themselves suddenly facing new possibilities and new challenges. The immediate crisis of survival had passed, Now came the harder work of building something new. As the last snow melted and the earth became workable, survivors began to move from the villages and towns where they had huddled through the winter. Some returned to the land to plant crops. Others moved toward regions that offered better opportunities or where they had heard labor was in high demand. Some moved toward the cities, drawn by the possibility of engaging in trade or craftsmanship in urban centers that were beginning to recover. This dispersal of the population was not organized or coordinated, but it represented a crucial turning point. The winter had been a time of consolidation, of gathering together in communities for mutual support and survival. Now, as the immediate crisis passed, survivors began to disperse again, though the pattern of settlement remained fundamentally different from what it had been before the plague. The dispersal also represented a kind of beginning. The survivors, having endured the worst, were now beginning to rebuild. They carried with them the memories of the plague, the trauma and loss that had marked them. But they also carried something else, knowledge. They knew in a way that pre-plague generations had never really understood that civilization was fragile, that social order could be overturned, that the old certainties could be stripped away. This knowledge would shape their choices and their decisions as they rebuilt. The forests that had grown back into abandoned land, the fields that lay untended, the empty cities that stood as monuments to what had been lost, all of these would gradually be reclaimed or abandoned, depending on the choices that survivors made. Some regions would be resettled and rebuilt. Others would be allowed to return to nature, to become wild again. The landscape of Europe would be reshaped by these decisions, made gradually and often unconsciously by thousands of individuals seeking to rebuild their lives. As spring fully arrived and the winter truly ended, the survivors found themselves in a world that was simultaneously familiar and utterly foreign. The towns and villages, the churches and great houses were still there, but they were emptier, often damaged, clearly marked by the passage of the plague. The land was still recognizable, but it was beginning to change. Forests growing back, fields reverting to wild growth. For those who survived that first winter, the experience had been transformative in ways that went far beyond the physical and material. They had learned something about resilience, about human capacity to adapt to radically changed circumstances. They had learned that the old social order was not as fixed and immutable as it had seemed. They had experienced a kind of leveling, a temporary moment when all were equal in their vulnerability, and their survival was dependent on mutual aid. These lessons would shape European society for centuries to come. The memory of the plague, of the winter of silence and isolation, would persist in art and literature, in social movements and religious thought. People would reference the time of the plague when arguing for changes to social organization. They would point to it as evidence that change was possible, that the old ways could be different. The winter that followed the end of the death carts was, in many ways, the crucial turning point in European history. Not because it was the most dramatic moment, that would come during the plague itself, but because it was the moment when survivors began to actively reconstruct civilization, when they began to make choices about what to preserve and what to abandon, when they began to imagine and build a different future. In the century and more that followed that winter, Europe underwent radical transformation. The feudal system, weakened by the plague and challenged by survivors who had experienced its alternatives, gradually gave way to new forms of social and economic organization. Cities grew and became more important. Trade and commerce expanded. Intellectual and artistic movements flowered, eventually becoming what later generations would call the Renaissance. Scientific thinking began to develop, challenging the ancient authorities that had held sway for centuries. Not all of these changes were direct results of that winter. Many had complex causes stretching back centuries, but all of them were shaped by the plague and its aftermath, by the fact that survivors had experienced a world stripped of its certainties and had found new possibilities emerging in that vacuum. The quiet of that winter, the absence of the death carts and their terrible sounds, had been a threshold. On one side was the medieval world, with all its hierarchies and certainties. On the other side was something new, still forming, still uncertain, but shaped by the experiences of those who had endured the catastrophe. For those survivors, huddled around fires on long winter nights, looking up at stars newly visible in darkened skies, Telling stories and imagining futures, the silence must have seemed profound. Not just the absence of sound, but the absence of the old certainties, the old ways, the old world. In that absence there was fear and trauma, but also possibility. There was space for something new to grow. The winter nights that followed the end of the plague were, in many ways, the first quiet nights that Europe had known in 1,000 years. Not because there had been constant noise before, of course there had been quiet in pre-plague times, but because the noise of certainty, of an established order that seemed eternal and unchangeable, had been replaced by a profound uncertainty. The old order had been revealed as temporary and fragile. The future was open. In that openness, survivors began to ask new questions, to imagine new possibilities. What kind of society did they want to build? What aspects of the old world were worth preserving, and what could be discarded? What new things might be created from the ruins of what had been lost? These questions did not have immediate answers. The process of rebuilding was slow and often painful, marked by many setbacks and conflicts. But the fact that these questions were being asked at all, the fact that survivors felt empowered to imagine alternatives to what had been, represented a fundamental shift. The death carts had been the symbol of the plague, the most visible and audible manifestation of the catastrophe. When they stopped coming, it signaled that the worst was over. In their absence, Europe began the long process of recovery and reinvention. The winter silence that followed was pregnant with possibility, marked by both trauma and hope, by loss and the potential for new growth. In the spring that followed that winter, when survivors emerged from their shelters and began the work of rebuilding, they carried with them the memory of that silence, that absence of the familiar sounds and structures of civilization. They carried it not as trauma alone, but as knowledge, the knowledge that the world could be different, that humans could adapt and survive, that new possibilities could emerge from the ruins of the old. This knowledge would manifest differently in different people and different regions. Some would become more religious, interpreting the plague as a divine punishment and seeking to build a more pious society. Others would become more skeptical, questioning the authorities that had failed to prevent or explain the catastrophe. Some would focus on material reconstruction, rebuilding the cities and fields. Others would focus on spiritual and intellectual questions, seeking to understand what the plague meant and how to live in a post-plague world. But all of them carried something from that winter, a recognition that change was possible, that human agency mattered, that the future was not predetermined. This recognition, born from trauma and loss, would gradually reshape European civilization over the centuries that followed. The story of that winter is the story of how the old world died and a new world began to be born. It is not a story of simple progress or inevitable improvement. Rather, it is a story of human resilience, of communities learning to support each other in the face of catastrophe, of societies experimenting with new forms of organization when old ones had failed. It is a story that has lessons for any time of profound disruption and change. It reminds us that catastrophe, while terrible, can create space for transformation. That established systems, however old and apparently permanent, can be changed when circumstances make change necessary. That humans faced with impossible challenges often prove capable of adapting, surviving, and even finding meaning and purpose in the aftermath of loss. The winter after the death carts was not a time of comfort or ease. It was a time of hardship, loss, trauma, and psychological pain. But it was also a time of possibility, of new beginnings, of the slow work of rebuilding both material civilization and the meanings that give life purpose. For those who lived through it, it was simply a winter, a time to be endured. But for those who look back on it from later centuries, it represents something more profound. The moment when Europe learned that it could survive catastrophe, that it could rebuild from ruins, that the future was not as fixed and certain as the past had seemed. As the snow melted and spring arrived fully, as the survivors dispersed from the towns and began their work of rebuilding, the first quiet night of the post-plague era gradually gave way to the sounds of human activity again. But those sounds were different now, shaped by the experience of survival, marked by the knowledge that had come from enduring the plague and the winter that followed. The silence of that winter, the profound absence of the sounds of the death carts, the reduced human population, the stripped-down civilization, had been a crucible, In that silence, survivors had been forced to confront the deepest questions. What did it mean to be human? What was worth preserving of the old world? What new things might be created? How should society be organized? What kind of future was worth building? These questions did not have quick or easy answers. They would occupy European thought and action for centuries to come. But they had been asked in that winter, asked in the silence that followed the end of the death cards, and the asking itself was transformative. The survivors of that winter did not know that they were living through a pivotal moment in history. They did not understand that they were participants in a transition from one era to another. They knew only that they had survived something terrible, that they were cold and often hungry, that those they loved had been taken from them, and that they had to continue living despite the pain and loss. But in their continuing, in their rebuilding, in their gradual reimagining of civilization, they were doing something profound. They were demonstrating the resilience of human communities, the capacity of people to adapt to radical change, the possibility of creating new meanings and new social forms when the old ones had failed. The winter after the death carts was cold and dark, marked by loss and trauma. But it was also the beginning of something new, the threshold moment when Europe began the long process of transformation that would eventually lead to the modern world. In the silence of those winter nights, under stars newly visible in darkened skies, with communities huddled together for warmth and survival, the foundation was being laid for a different future. The death carts had stopped coming. Civilization had survived its greatest test. And in the space created by that survival, new possibilities began to emerge. For those who lived through it, the winter was simply what came next, the natural consequence of survival. But for history, for the long arc of human civilization, it represented a turning point. It was the moment when the medieval world ended and something new began to take shape. It was the quiet after the storm, the silence after the worst of the noise had passed, the threshold between what had been and what would come next. This, then, is the story of that winter. Not the winter of plague itself, but the winter that followed, the first winter of silence and recovery, the beginning of rebuilding after catastrophe. It is a story that speaks to the human capacity for resilience, for adaptation, for finding meaning and purpose even in the aftermath of profound loss. It is a story about how societies change, how the old orders can be overturned and new ones created, how catastrophe, while terrible, can create space for transformation and renewal. The survivors of that winter carried its lessons forward into their lives and into the generations that followed. They understood, in a way that their ancestors had not, that the world could change, that humans could adapt, that new futures were possible even when the present seemed bleak and hopeless. This understanding, born from the depths of winter and the silence that followed the end of the death carts, would shape European civilization for centuries to come. And so the story of that winter is, ultimately, a story of human persistence in the face of catastrophe, of community and mutual aid in times of crisis, of the possibility of transformation when old systems have failed. It is a story that echoes across the centuries, reminding us of the depths of human suffering, but also of the heights of human resilience. It reminds us that we are capable of surviving the unsurvivable, of finding meaning in chaos, of building new worlds from the ruins of old ones. The quiet nights that followed the end of the death carts were not the end of Europe's story, but a beginning written in silence and loss, in cold and darkness, in trauma and survival. A beginning that would gradually transform into growth and recovery, into new ideas and new forms of social organization, into the eventual flowering of the cultural and intellectual movements that would define the centuries to come. This is the winter we remember, not for its harshness alone, though it was harsh, but for what it meant, for what it enabled, for the transformation it represented. It was the winter when Europe learned to live after plague, when civilization survived its greatest test, when the possibility of a different future began to emerge from the ruins of the past.